What is so special about Argo CD that it became the most widely adopted GitOps tool? Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 11th episode of Argo Unpacked. Today, with me, as usual, hey, Dan.
Hey, Ravital.
Together, we're going to host Pasha.
Hello,
Hey,
Pasha.
Hello, Pasha, and
hey,
we will be
hey.
talking about Argo CD architecture, its component, and why it is so widely adopted.
So you can see actually from our current setup that for the very first time, Ravital and I are recording from the same location. So we'll try not to cross the streams too much. That's pretty exciting, though. We don't usually get to record from the same location. And of course, Pasha, you're joining us from some kind of fortress of solitude, it looks like.
Yeah, yes. It's
This looks
it's
like the
good
place
place.
that General Zod gets banished to, the Never Realm or whatever it is.
Yep.
Well, for people that don't know, of course, we're going to be talking, like Ravital said, about why Argo CD is so popular, and then getting into the architecture of Argo CD. So if you're not familiar with how Argo CD actually works, this is going to be a great episode for you to listen to.
And why Pasha? Why do we have Pasha here?
Pasha is one of the main Argo CD maintainers. I am the lesser of Argo CD maintainers, and Pasha is one of the most prolific maintainers of the last couple of years. Has had a huge impact on the project. If you've had a pull request merged, there was a good chance that Pasha was one of the people doing that review at some point in the last few years. We've got like Michael Crenshaw, who's project lead, but I would put Pasha up right up around that same level with Michael. So I know
he was also one of the top 5 contributors.
Yeah, last year.
Yeah.
Last year and the year before as well, I think. And when I have an issue that I don't know how to solve with Argo CD, which happens surprisingly often, Pasha is usually the first person that I go and ping and ask for help. So, so Ravital, you wanted to start us off with the question of why Argo CD?
Yes. Why Argo CD? There were tools before that for CD, not CI, for CD, Jenkins and GitLab. So why was Argo CD even invented in the first place?
Yeah, so let's start with just the history here for a second. So a lot of people that are familiar with Argo CD don't know that it's not the first Argo. Of course, that's Jason and the Argonauts, the sailors in the Aegean Sea in ancient Greece. But in the modern world, the very first Argo was actually Argo Workflows. And Argo Workflows was designed to take advantage of Kubernetes primitives, where you could define a workflow that would execute in multiple pods, so you could take advantage of resources across multiple nodes. And this gives you a unique opportunity to do things like, hey, I want to use 5,000 GPUs that are part of this Kubernetes cluster to do a really big workload. Argo Workflows is really the only game in town to do something like that. And so as the team was working on Argo Workflows, the need came up to say, hey, we need a way to get these workflows onto the Kubernetes cluster. We're updating them all the time. It's very tedious for us to go and just manually apply these over and over again. So what if we had a way to automatically do that? I think the idea really started with Ed, who's over at Intuit now. And of course, the team developed that and changed the name of Argo to Argo Workflows and introduced Argo CD as such an effective tool for deploying software. So that's kind of the starting point of where Argo came from and the need to deploy. So Pasha, you've done a lot of work on the architecture. Which aspect, or maybe we should actually start with, let's step through how Argo CD functions from the standpoint of what it's actually doing.
Yep, sure. So Argo CD I will try to do a quick overview of main components, and after I will disclose how it behaves and what it's doing. So first of all, Argo CD has 3 main components, which named Argo CD API server, application controller, and repo server. So they all doing the different. They all have different responsibilities. API server is primarily interact with UI and command line interface. Argo CD controller is actually responsible for deploying your manifests to the Kubernetes cluster, like compare difference and verify what was changed and doing the actual deployment if needed, if something was changed. And repo server is interacting with your Git and fetching your manifest, also doing a very important job of templating. So if you have manifest in Helm or Customize or any other tools, it's actually doing templating for you. So original question was that how Argo CD works. So it's actually not Argo CD application controllers doing reconciliation every 2 minutes and checking if any changes happens in your Git by revision, and if it detects that any changes and any difference between your live state and desired state it's states that you have in Git, and if it's noticed any changes, it's automatically doing deployment for you. Here, a lot of optimizations on live state and desired state. For example, it's not checking. It's like caching your live state and optimize it and update the cache in Redis every time when something changed in your cluster. The same, a lot of optimizations on Git level and so on. So it's in the end, the whole idea is that you're just taking live state, desired state, and during reconciliation, it verify if something changed between these two, and if something happened, it's applying the changes. It's also used different diffing strategies like client side, server side, and three-way diffing, like where it's you have last status update on resource, and yeah, that's actually primarily it. I hope it's answered.
And I don't think we can understate, actually, since we've stepped through kind of the process here, how different this is from old traditional deployments. When I first started developing software, I would write a change and then I would generate from that some kind of patch, or I might just zip up the entire thing. I would put it into a zip file and I would email it to a system administrator. It wasn't DevOps back then. And that he would go and deploy that. He would basically copy the files onto the new server, and then he would switch the load balancer for the server to point at that. And if there was an issue, he would switch the load balancer back, email me back, and say, "Hey, that didn't work. Send me a fix." And that was pretty janky. That wasn't very good. And as I got more into software development, I always thought, wouldn't it be really cool if I actually thought that I was doing something wrong, because I thought there's got to be more experienced people that are doing this the right way. Because I would write my changes, put them into Git, and I kept on wondering, why doesn't my server just pull from Git? And so I would set up, like, I would go log into the server and do a Git pull of what I had deployed in Git. And there just wasn't any way to just automate that. Maybe I could use Jenkins, but then I still have to, like, SSH into the server automatically. And so a lot of people would do this using Jenkins, but they wouldn't check it out they would do a push model, right? So they wouldn't pull from the server. They would make their changes, and then Jenkins would connect to and deploy, files or whatever, if it was a WAR file or an image or whatever it was, depending on your deployment target. So the real key prerequisite for why Argo CD couldn't exist in the first place comes down to state management. Kubernetes offers these amazing primitives where you can actually monitor the state of all of your stuff in real time. There's no other tool like that. Terraform comes kind of close because you can monitor things, but the things that Terraform is monitoring state for aren't necessarily designed to track state oftentimes. And so you can know that maybe a VM exists, but what's on that VM is anybody's guess. It's not really part of the equation. So Terraform isn't and this isn't a knock on Terraform. Terraform is a great tool, and of course we use it, but it has a different job. But Argo has this ability to monitor the state that is coming from Kubernetes, which is always being updated. So if a pod isn't running, we know about it. If a service changes, if there's a new ingress, if there's events, we can track all that stuff. We have all that information, and then we can compare it directly against Git to know what the difference is. And that diff ends up being so valuable, because of course there are also other tools that were developed to take changes from Git and deploy it to your cluster. But the diffing, I think that's one of the things that made Argo CD so popular in the very beginning and remains popular today, is that I can make a change, I can see the diff on my Argo UI, and okay, now I can click sync knowing exactly what's about to change, and I get that real-time information. Even if you're using something like Terraform, you've got a tool like Atlantis that can show you kind of a preview of changes in your pull request, but it's not really like that's not a live state, it's a snapshot, right? And again, this isn't a knock on Terraform. These are tools that operate on different levels. So I'm making a comparison, but it's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison, because they operate in different spaces.
And we actually had an episode exactly about that with Costis, right?
Oh yeah.
GitOps
We did an episode on
Terraform.
Terraform versus GitOps. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, this really Argo opens up the possibility of doing GitOps. Before we jump back into the architecture and deeper into the architecture, maybe we should each say one of our favorite Argo CD features. Because I mentioned diffing, not necessarily my favorite feature, but what's your favorite feature, Ravital, in Argo CD since you've started working with it?
I'm not sure it's a feature, but I was really, really impressed by the UI. I was impressed by the fact that you can interact with the UI. You can see the state. If you have a healthy state, you see a very green, nice, healthy state. If something is not in sync, you can see out of sync. You can really, really understand what's going on right now with my application.
Yeah, it has kind of become the de facto Kubernetes dashboard for a lot of people.
Yeah.
What about you, Pasha?
Yeah, I think it's very popular use case overall across the people. It's like Kubernetes dashboard, what you just said. It's I would say that it's probably my very favorite use case. Is just like tree view, where you can see all your resources, logs, operate with resources, restart if you need them, and so on. Also, I think it's very nice that Argo CD is built on top of in declarative way, that you also can operate with application state in declarative ways, that you don't need UI. You can just go inside in Kubernetes and you can see the exactly same information that you can see just in UI. So it's really nice.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think if I were going to go to my favorite feature overall, I would say it's the ability to ignore differences, because this is it's such a game-changing feature. When you talk about GitOps, your desired state is stored in Git, but there are things that are like meta state that you shouldn't necessarily have to make a commit for. So something like, I want to make this service be able to expand the number of replicas as needed. So horizontal pod auto scaling, very common use case, because I don't want to have to make a Git commit every single time that traffic changes to my, my server. I want to have that operating more elastically. So you can have a horizontal pod autoscaler running, and in Argo CD, you can add a field, ignore differences, which will basically prevent any difference from showing on a specific path or field within your manifests. So what you're really doing is you're delegating the replicas field to a controller. And you're specifying that that's actually owned by something else. And in this case, usually it's what would be like a pod autoscaler. And that ignore differences then allows you to have a state, a baseline state that makes sense, but you can also take advantage of controllers that allow a little bit more elasticity or adaptability in your application. I think that's so cool. I think without that feature, Argo CD would be an interesting tool, but maybe not a production ready tool. So many people wouldn't be able to use autosync without diffing, custom diffing. So I think those are some of the reasons that we think that Argo CD is so successful. Pasha, you stepped through the process, and when I am dealing with issues in Argo CD, I feel like they're almost always related to a repo server.
Yeah, I would put it into few categories. Probably, I think if it's related to execution, yes, maybe you're right. In such case, it's mostly related to repo server because it's doing very important job with manifesting and all the things. But I would also say that API server has also significant amount of open issues because it's actually interface how people interact with it at command line. I found the interesting thing that it also contains ABAC. ABAC is very complex in Argo CD. It contains different configurations, use cases, and so on, especially because Argo CD is not multi-tenant application. So I would say that API server deserves the place in security area because we as Octopus Deploy, we're doing significant job in security fixes, and this component deserves some place here. So
yeah, I was gonna say, like, I think Pasha, you actually are the #1 security contributor to Argo CD for fixing disclosures that people send us. And so it makes sense that you're like, actually, I think API server gives me a lot more grief because almost all of our security issues.
Yes, it makes sense that it's here because it's customer facing.
Dan, weren't you the number 3 or 2?
Well, so I was the number 3 committer last year. But the truth of that is that most of my commits were because I was reviewing other people's pull requests, and I would have small suggestions in there, maybe improving some documentation or things like that. Every once in a while, I would have a code suggestion, and keeping the project on track in that way. And so I ended up co-authoring a lot of PRs, but Pasha does much harder engineering work. I'm a pretty mediocre developer, and Pasha is actually like a very good developer. He's a very good engineer.
Yes.
So I want to ask you guys a question related to contribution. If I were to contribute, my question is, which of the components need the most help from contributors? Not which of the components will be the great place for me to get started with, but which of those components need the most attention, I would say.
Yeah, I would still split it into 2 parts. However, you mentioned that not about where to start, but if you're doing step back, if you're new in contributions, it's always nice to start with API server because here is like mostly straightforward fixes related to command line. It's not just fixes; it's also you can suggest improvements in command line and API server and so on. We have a lot of open issues and also security. But if you take where is the help needed, really, to be honest, I didn't do the classification. Maybe Dan did, but I think that both of components of application controller and repo server, they need some help. Probably the controller requires more performance improvements and some performance testing, but and repo server contains more like logical issues.
They're where between repo server and application controller, that's where all of the meat and potatoes is of this thing. So like checking out your Git repos you need to have a caching system that works with that, and that needs to be reliable, and you need to have different keys, and you need to handle multiple branches, and you need to have permissions, and you also need to have dynamic pathing, because what repo server does, if you think about it, is it checks out arbitrary code. And when you're designing a system, having it deal with arbitrary code is the most difficult thing to deal with, because it means that the user can put anything in there. And so if you're trying to attack Argo CD, early on we had predictable pathing in repository server, which meant that if you had a Helm chart that was formatted in a certain way, you could reference things outside of the directory that you were checked out into, which means you could potentially get information from other applications. And truth is, with Argo CD, these are generally teams, that are working together that are deploying here. So you're not getting randos from the internet uploading stuff into repo server unless you're deploying random Git repositories. You could deploy random Git repositories too. But there's actually a tool that Pasha built and I helped work on in our hack directory that allows you to spin up, for testing purposes, V clusters and Argo CD applications. It will generate them. So if you wanted to do performance benchmarking, this tool in the hack folder will let you spam thousands of applications and servers and stuff. Well, the way that we generate applications is we take forks of the example application repository and we deploy those. Well, people could put whatever the heck they wanted in there. So that's why that tool is oriented, and we say, like, hey, you can use that for performance testing, but don't use it on like a cluster that where people can do things, because you're actually deploying arbitrary code when you're running that tool. And again, it's just for performance testing, benchmarking, and stuff like that. So we don't consider it an issue in that way. But that just goes back to the importance of repo server. And so if you were going to make a contribution, that's where there's a lot of very important code in repo server. It's all important code. We don't have any unimportant code. But application controller is another one that has a lot of implications on scale, because you're actually applying manifests and things like that.
I would also mention that repo server is also pretty scale intensive application, because you can put big, like, think about the repo server also doing Helm templating for you. And you also can put pretty big Helm charts and so on in your Git repo, and you also can overload resources of repo server. So it's also a very problematic component in terms of resources consumption. So I found interesting that one of the good practice, it's doing Helm templating in your pipelines or outside of Argo CD, and just put plain manifest in Git, so it will not affect performance of repo server so much. You can split this logic.
This is the rendered manifest pattern.
Yep.
Has become popular over the last few years. And it also has, it's funny actually, because I've talked to people who will say, hey, Intuit has this amazing scale of Argo CD. How come mine doesn't scale like that? And Intuit actually pre-renders all their manifests, just like you said. Now, they don't do it for performance reasons. They do it to make diffing easier, because you have kind of a hydrated version of your manifests. But it also has the side benefit of also improving performance, especially when you're dealing with very large Helm charts or multiple dependencies. So a lot of people will have like an umbrella chart that's referencing 10 different things. Well, that's quite memory intensive. A lot of network stuff is going on when you're building those. And so to even do a diff operation, and you need to refresh that's a computationally expensive operation. So yeah, the rendered manifests do have a pretty big performance impact, or can.
Okay.
Yeah, you can control repo server configurations. I don't remember all the configs, but repo server by default is writing to TMP folder. So it's very important that if you're doing big manifests, because Argo CD is doing git clone, in order to operate with repo server is doing git clone, in order to operate with git because it's doing checkout and so on. So make sure that if you run on big load, you're not using, you're kind of using some sort of PVC with 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 big size disk, so
Yeah.
you will not have problems here.
Well, actually, this is another point to bring up because we haven't talked about Redis at all. And Argo CD, when you deploy it, the manifests will include Redis. But Redis is a throwaway cache. So Redis is storing the state of what's happening on your cluster, right? So all those manifests are being basically loaded into the Redis cache so that when we can do diffing operations, we don't have to do them against the Kubernetes API. It's much, much faster, much more performant. But Redis isn't required. So you can deploy Argo CD and disable Redis entirely, and it will still work. It just is slow.
I was actually thinking that it's not optional, that it's a required component, Redis.
Yeah, you
Okay.
can deploy Argo CD and just disable Redis, and instead it will just go and hit the Kubernetes API. So it'll be a lot less performant than it is. But that's kind of actually one of the brilliant things about the Argo CD architecture is that it's resilient in a way. So like Redis can fail and you can still do things. And it also, the way that the components are designed with repo server and application controller, you can ramp those up with replicas, and you can actually shard out to different clusters, can be managed by different application controllers. And so that allows Argo CD to have this really massive scale potential where you can make quite large Argo CD instances.
Yep, I would just mention that without Redis you probably can deploy, but you will not be able to see your resources in UI because it's actually when controller starts, it's put your all live state in Redis, and it's very important component of Argo CD. So if you run on big load, it's preferable to use some external Redis with scale.
Yeah, it's like you can drive a car with 3 wheels. Like it works. It'll get down the road. It's not a great experience. I don't recommend it. Definitely not going fast on the freeway, but like you technically only need 3 of those wheels just to move in most cars. I guess it depends on the car. But yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, you don't not deploy Redis. And also there's times when you want to deploy Redis HA for sure, because you're going to get more performance and you have, a lot of clusters, or really driven by resources is what it's driven by, that are under management. But yeah, that's a good point.
So Redis is another component. What about Dex? This one is an optional component, right?
Yeah, we have a lot of optional nice components. It's like Dex, application set controller, notification controller, which we primarily maintain. And if you want to go quickly over them, so Dex is giving you ability to use SSO. If you want to configure your SSO provider, it's very natural way to do it with Argo CD. It's also recommended way if you want to send some notifications when your application is changed or something happened inside your cluster. You can use notification controllers, support huge amount of providers. And application set, it's also very popular replacement or additional for app of apps button, where you can generate a bunch of applications with same template. For example, primary use cases, multi-region support, where you can just want to have 2 regions or 3.
Yeah, you want to make a single configuration that generates applications for each cluster that you have connected, or maybe you want to do it to generate applications based on Git folders or your SCM providers, or maybe you want to do applications for every pull request in a repository. So application sets, that was my maybe number 2 favorite feature. After, I mean, custom diffing is so fundamental, but application sets are just so valuable and such a popular tool. They're so useful. They save so much time, but they can be challenging to debug too. We did have some tools that we added in Argo CD 2.14, I think it was, that make it so you can test those. But anyway, the point that you brought up, Pasha, is that all of those are optional. So if you don't want to use application sets, don't deploy it. If you don't want to use the notification controller, you don't have to. It's only there for, again, performance and optimization reasons, where, for example, by default, Argo CD is checking a Git repository every 2 minutes, or is it 5 minutes? I can't remember. 5 minutes, I think. And if you want to get changes more quickly, then you should enable a webhook, and that's a separate. That's its own function, and it has to go through the notification controller. And if you take advantage of that, then you can get changes more quickly, and you can potentially even lower how often you're checking Git for changes, which is valuable when you have lots of applications and maybe you're running out of API requests, or maybe you have quite large manifests or whatever that need to be checked out as well. There's lots of reasons why you'd want to optimize for Git, especially if you're using application sets. And so you do have an option to do that. But actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Pasha, application sets and applications they need their own webhooks set up. Do they use a different notification controller?
I think that Pasha
did he just
got
drop?
disconnected. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll wait for him to come back.
Okay. I have a question for you then, meanwhile. Yeah. So we were talking about the architecture and the 3 main components, and I'm curious about Argo CD core. When will you be using the Argo CD core architecture? Should I call it architecture or?
Yeah, well, it's a deployment option.
Yeah.
So Argo CD core is basically Argo CD without the UI.
Okay.
And
so without the API server component, basically?
Yeah, is the API server just not even deployed? I'm trying to remember if you deploy with the API server or if it's just disabled the UI component. I think it may be without the API server entirely, but basically the reason you'd use it is you want to have a fully automated, fully headless version of Argo CD, and you don't want to deploy the UI. You don't want.
Is it common to deploy it without the UI?
Not really, because again, Argo CD is pretty performant.
So in which use cases would I do that?
If you were just focused on kind of like an infrastructure, you didn't want people to be using it, okay, right? So you would have like, I'm going to bootstrap Argo CD, and it's going to automatically add some applications, and those are going to automatically get deployed, and then no one's ever going to touch this. Then I don't need the UI. Okay. And so I don't need to deploy it. But I think actually, Pasha, when you deploy core, I think it includes the API server. We need the API server. It just doesn't include, there's a separate like UI server.
Oh, good question. We didn't deploy core for a long time, but definitely it's not deploy UI. And yeah, I think it requires API server, so it is deploying. Yeah.
Yeah. This is actually something funny too, Ravital. I had been contributing to Argo CD for literally years before I figured out that we actually deploy the same Argo CD image across most of these services. So we build one Argo CD image that plays the role of repo server and application controller and the API server. And it was like literally, it was like last year. I was like talking to Alex G, And I was like, oh, is that part of that image? And he's like, it's all the same image. And I was like, what? It's all been the same image this whole time? I'm like, I just never even thought about it. We have fully automated build processes. It just happens automatically. I just never like even realized. I was like, didn't spend enough time looking at the manifest to be like, wait, these are all the same image. I think that was a brilliant choice, by the way, but it's different for application set. I think we still use a different image for application sets.
Not sure. I think we migrated it back then once it was introduced as part of Argo CD project. I think we moved to Argo CD image. However, I can be wrong, but I think it's already.
Well, it tells you how kind of trivial it is because of the automated nature of the way that Argo CD works, that we're like, oh yeah, is that one even in the same image or not? Like, I can't remember. If you're developing locally, you're using these services. They're in their own services. So you're using like Gorman to run these services, and you're making updates, and it's updating for you locally. And then when you commit it, it's gonna build using the build process and create the images for you. So you don't really think about it. But yeah, I remember I went to go do something, and I was like, oh, like I need to make sure this image is updated. And then I was looking at it, and I was like, wait, that's like the same image as the other one. Wait, how's that work? And then Alex G from Intuit actually pointed out to me. We were talking one day, and I was like, where's this thing? And he's like, they're all the same image. Anyway, so yeah, I think some takeaways about this architecture is how flexible and resilient it is, because you can expand repo server, you can expand application controller. You don't have to deploy notifications. You don't have to deploy application sets. You can just deploy the components you need when you need them, and leave the rest on the cutting room floor. And that's pretty brilliant architecture, I think. Pasha, you actually did a lot of work to introduce, and now Yevgeny from the team is doing some additional work on it as well. You introduced a new controller, which is now in the Argo CD. It's in the Argo labs, Argo project labs for monorepo. And why did we do it as a separate controller? Because I remember when you and I talked about it, when you first came up with the idea, let's outline the problem. The problem is when Argo CD refreshes Git, it checks to see if there's a newer commit, and then it takes the latest commit. So if your repository had 3 commits that happened in between the last time it refreshed and now, it just takes the latest one. And then when it syncs everything to that latest commit. Well, that means that if you have changes to one application and then changes to a second application, when you sync, the first application will show that it's synced to the commit that is actually the changes to the second application. Now, it's not a problem from a function standpoint of, hey, your stuff still got deployed. It's still correct. But when you're in the UI, or you're saying, hey, show me what last sync operation happened, and you click on the commit, it's going to take you to a diff that is not related to the application. That was the goal to solve it. And when you and I talked about it, I said, hey, why can't we just do it as part of repo server to pass in the commit? Maybe we do a sparse checkout or something like that. And you actually said, hey, it's going to be a lot better as a controller. So walk me through that decision and why we decided to make it.
The problem that you may have only few commits in difference, and in such cases probably will not be so big issue. For example, you're doing regular commits and so on, and you just have 1-2 commits difference between your relevant commit and actual latest commit in your monorepo. But the problems appear when you, for example, you have some service that you update very rare, like, I don't know, you did update last year ago, and you may have huge amount, and you work in really big monorepo where the whole big organization is contributing. and you may have thousands and thousands of commits between your relevant commit for this application and last one. And like this research and this actual search of relevant commit may take a lot of time, because you need to take all the history and go one by one over commits or something like this and find actually relevant commit to changes to files that you changed. So to put it into, we do have changes in repo server because we still need access to file system and we need to still to do list revisions operations, but the iteration and search of relevant commits, it's preferable to put outside, because all the reconciliation process, it's very intensive process because it happens very often. It happens every 2 minutes by default. And if you add in here even small change, it's already can increase for big amount of application. It's already can increase dramatically resources consumption on this controller. So here, not big deal to put, just because Argo CD use declarative way. It's another plus why I mentioned that declarative way is amazing. You still have access from different controllers to your application resources directly in cluster, and you can modify them if needed. So it's giving us ability to very quickly and easy to build different controllers. And yeah, for this we decided to move outside of controller and not impact existing customer. Also, we should think about this use case. It's still problem, but people complains about it, but not everyone really needs it. For example, if you don't really worry about observability and you don't using like Argo UI a lot, you just want your code to be deployed, you don't really need this controller.
So it really comes down to, first, not everybody needs it, but second, if you do need it, it does have a performance impact, and so by separating it out, we can avoid any impact to the repo, like repo server, things like that. We can scale it separately.
Yeah.
Does the monorepo controller scale? Can you add more replicas?
Yes. Yeah. You can pretty easy scale it. You can shard it. Yeah, it's also not doing again a lot of intensive work, but it's still nice to have, because as I mentioned, even small changes on application controller, it's giving you problems. It's also from isolation perspective. Think about it as labs project. Between you all welcome to contribute labs projects. It's very easy. You're just asking maintainer to open a repository for you, and you can create and implement any ideas that you want. So if it's labs project, it's also open fast way to move faster. We don't need to discuss any decision, because controller is very important part, and it requires the discussion of maintainers. If you're doing it as lab project outside of Argo CD, it's giving us the way to take decisions outside of maintainers and move separately and faster as a result.
Yeah, application sets started as Argo Project Labs. So very often we'll have things that are in labs that make their way into Argo as people adopt them. If people are crazy about monorepo controller and they're like, oh, like a lot of us have this problem, we really want it, and we see a lot of adoption, we may mature that into becoming part of the main Argo CD repository. And
only two projects was adopted to repository. It's notification controller and application set, as Dan mentioned, but it's preferable way to build them separately. We merging them only very important components are part of Argo CD.
Yeah, it's almost like a product philosophy where we don't, if we can add new features separately, then we can see adoption. Then, because once it's in the main repository, like we all have to maintain it and we have to fix it, But if monorepo controller came out, and we actually have a bunch of people already using it, but if it came out and nobody wanted it, then we don't have to keep supporting it. But it is a popular project, so I think we'll see more adoption of it as we finalize the the donation into Project Labs?
It's overall good practice not to contribute any significant changes to Argo CD because we have a lot of people that willing to add nice features to Argo CD. But in the end, the maintainers will need to support them, update and so on, security fixes and a lot of another following actions on this feature. So it's definitely a good way to put as much as possible outside of Argo CD.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean you can't make changes inside of Argo CD to support it. So, for example, the Intuit tool that Michael and Zach worked on is GitOps Promoter, which a little bit different for people that are more familiar with CodeFresh GitOps. CodeFresh GitOps is like solving a pretty broad problem. GitOps Promoter is a little bit more narrow because it's more about replicating manifests between environments. But anyway, that tool, for it to work, you need to have manifests being rendered. And so they started with that project, and through a lot of conversations, we were like, okay, let's separate out the manifest generation portion where you want to generate your manifests and commit them. Well, Argo CD is already generating the manifests, right? We've got repo server doing that. So if we add the ability to commit them, it logically would actually fit into repo server. So we have the rendered manifest component that was added as a feature in Argo CD, and I think it came out in 2.14 was the first iteration of it. And so now you can, and it's still a beta tool, but you can start using that. But that feature only exists in Argo CD because they also wanted to build the promotion tool. And so they were able to build that as a separate controller in Project Labs. And if people want to adopt that tool, they can do it. And they have support within Argo for it. But it, again, doesn't force it on all users or anything like that.
And it was not, I would say, a very easy decision. We had a lot of discussions where to put it, outside or inside of Argo CD. We had at least 2 rounds of discussions how it should be.
Yeah. Well, we've gone through architecture here, Ravital. What do you think? Do you have any questions?
Yes, I was hoping we can maybe talk a little bit about contributions.
Like getting started?
How to get started? What are some common mistakes that people are doing, and we can help them avoid those mistakes when installing, when contributing? But let's start with how to even get started.
Yeah, sure. So we have contributors guide first of all. Second, we have a Slack channel which named Argo CD contributors. It's a bit different from Argo CD. It's especially relevant for people who is contributing. And I think third is more important, and we're doing a big amount of work here to support it. It's you just need to go to GitHub, to Argo CD, and filter by first good issue or good first issue, and to choose the items that primarily related, as I mentioned earlier, to command line or API server. It will be easiest for you to start because, again, repo server and application controller requires a lot of knowledge about Argo CD. I also can say, and it really requires help here, you can start even not with Argo CD. You can take Labs projects that are very popular. For example, notification engine it's part of notification controller. It's very valuable to start if you want to contribute, but it's like much easier to begin with. You also can take image updater projects that built by Red Hat. It's also very popular, and it requires some help here. And a lot of other things that around Argo CD to be better familiar with processes. And after that, you slowly can move to repo server and controller. But yeah, I think that's, if I would start to contribute right now, I would use it as plan.
And what things you would avoid? What mistakes can people do and you recommend them to avoid, if there are any?
I personally would not go for complex issues at the beginning because it's very risky. It's you can break, uh, release, and affect it. I would just start to take easy things and move slowly to more complicated. Because in the end, both, if you want to give value to the project, in the end, both simple and complex issues are the same value because
Okay.
in the end is just fixing bugs and resolving issues.
Yeah, it's when you work on a complex issue like that, it's so important to get a proposal approved. And so that's a separate pull request where you say, hey, here's the problem, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to solve it. And this is where you get interaction from the maintainers to say, okay, like, did you think about this? Are we covering this use case? Can you make sure we do it this way, or whatever those things are? And that way, when that proposal is approved, now you have a clear runway to go and develop that, and you can do so with confidence that your implementation is going to meet the expectations of maintainers, so it can get merged. But if you just shotgun, like, go and build something complex and throw up a pull request, people will be like, what the heck is this? What are you even doing? Why is all this changing?
Yeah.
Why is this? Why is that? And you end up going through a longer process than if you had just done the proposal in the first place. And then the other thing, I don't think Pasha had mentioned, if you mentioned it, I apologize, but every week we also have a Zoom meeting that is the Argo CD contributor experience meeting. It's on the CNCF calendar, it's on the Argo calendar. You can find it if you go to the Argo homepage. You can go to or the contributing guide, it'll show you where it is in the documentation. And that's a chance to ask questions and get answers live. And they're also, as you're working on stuff, if you need help there and you're using that Slack channel, like Pasha mentioned, I've seen quite a few times where someone like either Pasha or Michael or whoever will actually jump onto a Zoom with somebody and help them resolve something so they can start contributing. And finally, I am so close. By the time this episode is released, we have a pull request on getting ready to merge that Reggie has worked a lot on, and Yevgeny worked on it as well. That is a new and improved developer guide that's much more in depth and has a lot more information in it. Of course, go look at it for whenever you listen to this episode, and we have a contributor's guide. But depending on when you listen to it, might be an even better experience.
I will definitely try it out and provide some feedback. And we might even have Reggie coming over to one of the episodes, and we will be going through that together.
Great. Cool.
All right.
Well, I think we've covered architecture. We covered why people were using Argo CD, why it was so popular. Pasha, anything you want to plug? Anything you got going on you want to bring up?
No, thank you for inviting me. It was really a pleasure to talk with you. And
thank you for joining us. Here is a link to subscribe to our newsletter, to our coming episodes, and every information you want to get about Argo Unpacked. We also have our social, so feel free to follow us. And that's it for today.
And as always, stay synced.